I am Dr. Lawrence Atkins, Specialty Doctor in Psychiatry and Clinical Lead for Veterans Mental Health Services in the North of England at Leeds and York Partnership NHS Foundation Trust. I am the BMA's lead negotiator for SAS contract negotiations. The BMA has been engaged in contract negotiations with NHS employer organisations and Departments of Health and Social Care of the UK, Welsh and Northern Irish governments and NHS England and Improvement. These negotiations have focused on the introduction of a new 2021 specialty doctor contract and a new specialist grade contract. We are first going to explain how this process has worked, and then we're going to look at both of these contracts in detail. Finally, we're going to set out the next steps and the choice that you, as BMA SAS members, are going to have to make. First of all, it is worth setting out how we came to be here. Conducting negotiations throughout a pandemic year, which has been, unsurprisingly, incredibly busy and has placed significant demands on both staff and management sides. Initially, we approached the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care in 2019 to propose the reopening of the closed 2008 Associate Specialist grade in England. We have been aware of a number of employers that have sought to reopen the Associate Specialist grade at local level, identifying the need for this recognised group and the skills they bring to the NHS. Matt Hancock was initially very interested, as this represented a quick win, and he asked the staff at the Department of Health and Social Care to explore this idea further. After some discussions, the Department of Health and Social Care stated that while they did not think it appropriate to reopen the Associate Specialist grade, they were instead open to negotiating a new senior SAS contract, provided our discussions addressed the specialty doctor contract as well. This proposal was brought back to the BMA's SAS committee, a representative body made up of elected SAS doctors from around the country, who decided that it was content for us also to negotiate a new specialty doctor contract, as it believed there were a number of areas in which the existing contract could be modernised and improved, particularly in terms of pay and safeguards. The Department of Health and Social Care then produced their remit letter, inviting the BMA, NHS employers and other stakeholders to enter into negotiations before producing their formal mandate. Since that time, the Welsh and Northern Irish governments also declared their interest in being involved in contract reform, and representatives have joined both staff and management side negotiating teams. As a precursor to these negotiations, we conducted an extensive survey in 2019 to seek our members' views on what they would want to see from a new contract. The results of this survey were used to inform further discussions by our SAS committee and to develop our mandate for negotiations. Our priorities for any new contract were creating a senior SAS role that would provide a career progression pathway for SAS doctors, increases in basic pay, a flatter salary scale better suited to career average pension scheme and address the gender pay gap, introducing new contractual safeguards to preserve work-life balance, secure additional annual leave for SAS doctors who have been disadvantaged compared to other NHS staff groups, to review the way that unsocial hours work is remunerated, to improve flexibility for training, and to increase opportunities for career development, such as in leadership and training. It was based on these priorities that we produced our negotiating mandate and developed our strategy, setting our objectives and identifying potential gains and trade-offs and red lines. Through further discussion and deliberation amongst the UK SAS Committee, the heads of terms, that is, the areas agreed for discussion for these negotiations, were approved. The BMA's Pay and Contracts team are staff trained and experienced in negotiations. This team supported the committee in selecting and training a small team of elected SAS members to act as its negotiators. This group is selected based on skills and aptitude for specific roles. These roles include the leader, who is responsible for meeting organisation and maintaining relationships with the other side. There is also a spokesperson, who, unsurprisingly, does the majority of the speaking, based on positions that have been agreed in advance by the negotiating team based on the mandate. There are experts who focus on details and data, which is especially important when considering pay and modelling. Finally, there are the observers, who are there to watch the way that management side respond in discussions. As one of our team members has noted, we've spent a lot of time this year peering at webcams, trying to work out whether the reason someone from management side is frowning because they have not liked our position or because they're reading a difficult work email. The team works from the mandate that has been set by the committee and is overseen by the Strategic Reference Group. If we need to move away from the mandate, if, say, management side propose something that we haven't expected and don't have a position on, then we take it away, present it back to the committee and amend our position based on its decisions. This allows our mandate to develop responsibly and flexibly as discussions progress. Despite everything, we have managed to continue negotiating throughout this very difficult year. This was felt to be necessary because the funding for contract reform agreed by the Treasury was contingent on completing negotiations and introducing the contracts by April 2021. We had one or two meetings in person before, very suddenly, everything was conducted through virtual meetings. These have broadly been taking place twice a month, as we have progressed through all of the issues and contractual schedules, starting with the easier ones, where very few changes are being proposed, to the more complex and contested ones around safeguards, pay and work patterns. In December, we finalised the best offer that could be achieved by negotiation. This is for a package of 2 contracts. The first is a new 2021 specialty doctor contract, and the second is a new 2021 specialist grade contract. We are now going to take you through as much of the detail of these contracts as we can, all of the key improvements, all of the trade-offs, and to set out what the contracts might mean for you personally, so that when our referendum opens in February, you will have all the information you need to make the right decision for you. This will be supplemented by all of the supporting contract guidance that will be available on our website. Members can also send any questions they might have to our dedicated email address, sascontract@bma.org.uk.
Hello, my name is Amit Kochar. I am an associate specialist in ear, nose and throat surgery working at the University Hospitals Morecambe Bay NHS Foundation Trust. I am the past chair of the SAS committee and was part of the negotiating team, being the spokesperson on the negotiating team for this new contract. Here is an overview of the contracts, which summarizes the key changes. Firstly, a multiple year pay deal of 3% investment per full-time equivalent doctor per year over 3 years to introduce contract reform. The introduction of a new senior SAS grade, the specialist grade, something that hasn't been available at a national level since the closure of the associate specialist grade in 2008, creating a clear career framework for SAS doctors to develop through. This specialist grade will enable these senior doctors to receive the recognition they deserve. There will be a new, flatter pay scale that is better under a career average pension scheme, allows for faster progression. There will be a number of new safeguards to protect SAS doctors working the most onerous, unsocial hours working patterns and to preserve a reasonable work-life balance. We will also have increased on-call availability supplements in line with those received by consultants, and an additional day of annual leave after 7 years in the grade. We will have guidance to support the introduction of a new SAS advocate role to promote and improve support for SAS doctors' health and well-being. There will be ring-fenced funding dedicated to SAS improvement and development, disbursed in consultation with the local negotiating committee and the SAS advocate, and in line with guidance provided by the British Medical Association and NHS employers. We will have alignment with NHS staff terms and conditions of service benefits, including shared parental leave and child bereavement leave. This also includes changes to redundancy payment arrangements, which are more generous under the existing contract. The extension of plain time from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. on weekdays currently to 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. on weekdays, meaning that weekday work between 7 p.m. and 9 p.m. would be paid at standard rates. Lastly, there will be the opportunity for existing SAS doctors on national contracts to have an individual choice of whether or not they want to move to the new contracts. We will go into more depth on all of these points throughout this presentation. So who will be directly affected by the new contracts? The first thing to say is that what we are negotiating here are new contracts. That means that for existing SAS doctors on either the 2008 specialty doctor contract or the closed national 2008 associate specialist contract, no changes are going to be automatically made to your contract, your pay, or your working arrangements as a result of these negotiations. What we have insisted on throughout this process is individual choice. That means that if at the referendum, a majority of our members vote to approve the new contracts, you will still have a choice based on your own personal circumstances about whether or not you want to move to these new contracts. However, if a SAS doctor subsequently chooses to move employer or takes up a new appointment as with new entrants, they will be placed in the new contract. Those who do not choose to move and will not benefit from the contractual improvements secured through the new contract funding, and any uplifts to their pay will be dependent upon the usual DDRB processes. If the new specialty doctor contract is approved at the referendum, the 2008 contract will be closed to new entrants in much the same way as the associate specialist contract when that grade was closed, and will not be refreshed or updated in the future. For those on the 2008 specialty doctor contract, you will have a 6-month window of opportunity from the 1st of April 2021 to inform your employer whether you want to move onto the new 2021 specialty doctor contract. If you are on another closed national grade contract, such as the old staff grade contract, you will also be offered the choice of whether or not you want to move to the new 2021 contract. Likewise, for those on the 2008 closed National Associate Specialist contract, you will have a 6-month window to decide whether or not you would like to move to the new specialist grade contract. What this means is that when the time comes for the referendum, you do not need to make a decision solely on your personal circumstances. If you decide that the new contracts do not work for you, you can choose to remain on your existing contract, but approve or reject the contracts in a referendum based on whether you think they would be beneficial for the profession or not. It is worth noting that any doctor who has been appointed to an associate specialist post since the grade closed in 2008 will not be on the national contract and therefore technically do not have an automatic right to be offered choice about whether or not to move to the new specialist grade contract. In practice, however, employers will have discretion to allow such associate specialist doctors to move to the new specialist grade contract, and we think that there is a clear incentive for them to do so. Finally, it is worth noting that other trust grade doctors will unfortunately not be offered a choice in these negotiations in England and Northern Ireland. From the outset, the Department of Health and Social Care have been clear that their mandate and the funding for contract reform does not cover this group of doctors. All we can do, and what we hope we have done, is create a contract that is attractive for both employers and these doctors, so that local agreement can be reached for them to be placed on these contracts. In Wales, government and employers have agreed to issue guidance to health boards and trusts, requesting that they offer to transfer sufficiently experienced locally employed doctors to the new specialty doctor contract. Further guidance will set out principles for the appropriate use of local contracts in the future, ensuring that more long-term employees are employed on national terms and conditions in Wales. So, how do the two grades, the specialty doctor and specialist, interact? NHS employers have been clear that all specialist posts in future will be created at the discretion of the employer, whether they have identified a specific workforce need. While we are confident, based on survey data we have seen, that NHS employers have a strong interest in creating such posts, that means that specialty doctors will not have any automatic right to progress from their current grade into the new specialist grade. In that sense, it is no different to the current situation where specialty doctors cannot insist on being made associate specialists. Instead, they have to apply for such a role when it becomes available, much as one would have to apply for a newly created consultant post. However, we have been clear with employers that what we cannot have is a situation which we already see currently, where a dedicated specialty doctor is working at a senior level of responsibility and competence, and there is little incentive for their employer to offer them the opportunity to progress to a higher grade. We have sought to address this by making clear the distinction in roles and responsibilities between a specialty doctor and a specialist. The BMA will be producing guidance to support members in having conversations with employers to ensure that they are being remunerated at a level appropriate to their work, and to remove the financial incentive for employers not to make a specialist post available because they already have a specialty doctor delivering that work at a lower cost. Finally, our hope is that re-establishing a senior grade will make the career structure clearer for all SAS doctors, so that they can see themselves as part of a recognized, respected, and rewarded destination grade. So what is the specialist grade? The specialist grade will be a national senior SAS contract, which we have not had since the associate specialist grade was closed in 2008. It is, however, distinct from the associate specialist grade, as is made clear by the new title. As the framework agreement notes, doctors within the grade will be referred to as specialist, for example, specialist pediatrician or specialist cardiologist. The posts will be made available when an employer identifies a need. Based on engagement with employer stakeholders, we know that vast majority intend to use these contracts and make these posts available. Specialists will have completed a minimum of 12 years medical work since obtaining their primary medical qualification, of which 6 years will be in the relevant specialty in the specialty doctor or closed SAS grades. Equivalent experience from other medical grades and overseas will also be accepted. Beyond that, they will need to demonstrate that they meet the criteria set out in the specialist grade generic competency framework. This is still in the process of being developed by the BMA, NHS employers, and representatives of the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges, but is due to be signed off in February, at which point it will be shared with members along with all the other contract resources.
As part of these negotiations, in order to support contract reform, we have secured from the relevant National Health and Finance departments a multiple-year pay deal, set at 3% investment per full-time equivalent per year over 3 years. This investment applies only to the doctors who move to one of the new contracts. This incorporates an additional 1% that was recommended to support contract reform by the DDRB and accepted by the government in its pay award for 2019. Due to the requirements of the Comprehensive Spending Review and annual budgeting arrangements, the Welsh Government and Northern Ireland Department of Finance are only able to confirm the first of the 3 years of funding for their respective contracts. However, both nations are committed to prioritising the continued funding of the second and third years to ensure that contract reform can be completed. We do not have significant concerns that this funding will not be secured. In the context of the current economic climate, this 3% per year over 3 years is likely to be well above the rate of inflation, and the varied specific pay uplifts secured for each pay point of the new pay scale over the next 3 years are likely to be more generous than what might otherwise be awarded as an annual pay uplift. As we noted earlier, individuals on the 2008 Specialty Doctor and National Associate Specialist contracts will get a choice of whether or not to move onto the new contracts. Those who choose not to move will not benefit from the contractual improvements secured through this funding, and any uplifts to their pay will be dependent upon the usual DDRB processes and the government's decision about what pay uplift to award. We have had to carefully consider how best to use the funding available for these negotiations. This has not just been directed toward basic pay, but has also been used to fund other changes to the contract that incur a cost. We will look at these in more detail later. For now, we're going to focus on basic pay. Here you can see the existing pay scales for specialty doctors. It has 11 pay points with a combination of standard and threshold progression, taking a minimum of 17 years to reach the top of the scale. We have negotiated an increase to the specialty doctor pay scales and raised the bottom of the scale to make the contract an attractive career choice in the future, as well as allowing for easier movement in and out of training. In order to make significant changes to the pay scales, we have agreed to a 3-year transition period where the current pay points gradually merge into the 5 pay points that we want to see at the end of the process in 2023-24. Due to the differences in workforce distributions in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, the costs vary across the 3 nations. Therefore, in order to be affordable, the 3 will take slightly different paths over the 3 years of transition. The different journeys taken by the three nations are set out in the framework agreements published for each. However, all three will, at the end state, that is, in 2023-24, all look the same on this slide. The new specialty doctor scale will consist of 5 pay points, with a minimum of 3 years spent at each of the first 2 points before an individual can progress, with progression based on meeting criteria, which we will set out in a moment. This would mean that a doctor on this scale could progress to the top in 12 years, compared to at least 17 years under the previous specialty doctor scale. Again, for comparison, here is the existing scale for the closed associate specialist grade. 11 pay points, with a combination of standard and threshold progression, and 17 years to reach the top of the scale. As we have set out above, our intention has been to create a flatter pay scale which is more beneficial in a career average pension scheme and reduces the gender pay gap. The new specialist grade will consist of 3 pay points, with a minimum of 3 years spent at each of the first 2 points before an individual can progress. This would mean that a doctor on this scale could progress to the top in as little as 6 years, compared to at least 17 years for those who joined at the bottom of the Associate Specialist 2008 scale. It is worth noting that existing associate specialists can choose to move to the new contract, but whose basic pay is currently at the top of the specialist scale would be afforded pay protection on a marked time basis. This means that they continue to receive the same level of basic pay as they were receiving on the day before they transferred to the new contract, and this level is protected until the value of the specialist scale sufficiently increases to catch up with or exceed that protected level of pay. After that point, their pay would increase in line with any further uplifts made to the top of the specialist scale. So, the natural question is, how do SAS doctors under these new contracts progress through the pay scales? We have always felt that there is nothing wrong with the current arrangements, based on objective setting and appraisal, but that the issue we hear time and again is that employers don't make best use of the processes already available to them. What we have tried to do is build on these existing processes to keep it simple and to make sure that decisions around progression are fair and transparent. There will only be 2 types of progression, much as there are with the current system: standard progression and progression through a higher threshold. Standard progression looks much as it currently does. It will depend on satisfactory participation in annual job planning processes, making every reasonable effort to meet their job plan's commitments and personal objectives. Likewise, they will need to participate satisfactorily in the appraisal process and make every reasonable effort to complete mandatory training. Finally, they will need to have no outstanding or live disciplinary sanctions on their record. Provided these criteria are met, then the clinical manager or medical director will sign off on their pay progression, which the contract requires must be done in a timely fashion. If the process is delayed, the pay would be backdated to the point at which the progression should have taken place. Progression through a threshold will require all of the same criteria to be met, but will be required to also demonstrate the following, which is the same criteria as the current threshold 2. An increase in ability to take decisions and carry responsibility without direct supervision, evidence of contributions to a wider role, such as management or leadership, service development and modernisation, teaching and training of others, committee work, representative work, innovation and audit. That's not an exhaustive list, but indicates the kind of evidence that can be provided. It's also worth noting that the contracts will explicitly state that doctors require appropriate support and development through job plan review, appraisal, and supporting professional activities, and that demonstrating a contribution to a wider role may require reassessment of the balance between supporting professional activities and direct clinical care duties and allocations. Finally, it should be noted that the contract also specifies that it is expected that the doctor will achieve the required standards at the point of their pay progression date, and that they should not be penalised if any element of the progression criteria have not been met for reasons beyond their control. In that case, if they have been prevented from meeting the criteria due to any action or inaction on the part of the employer, they will not be prevented from moving to the next pay point. As ever, doctors will still be able to use the same processes of mediation and appeal as they can under the current contract. Specialists will have fewer pay points to progress through before they are at the top of the pay scale, meaning they should reach it earlier in their careers. Their pay progression will depend upon them meeting the same kinds of criteria around job planning, appraisal, and objectives, and mandatory training, where meeting these are within the individual's control, as well as having no live disciplinary issues on their record. Additionally, they will need to have undertaken anonymous colleague and patient feedback since appointment or their last progression, and demonstrate learning from these results. They will also need to have performed a full audit cycle in a chosen aspect of their personal clinical practice, and once again demonstrate learning from the results. This audit will be agreed upon in advance during their job planning process. Finally, specialists will need to demonstrate the ability to deliver learning to others by completion of either clinical or educational supervisor training and/or delivery of a minimum of one educational lecture or workshop relevant to their area of practice. As with specialty doctors, the contract makes it explicitly clear that the requirements on the employer to complete the process in a timely way that cannot delay an individual's pay progression, and sets out the support and opportunities they must offer to help you gain the experience and skills required to progress. One of management side's red lines in these negotiations has been changing the definition of plain time from a weekday 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. to 9 p.m., extending it by 2 hours. This has been their most significant ask. It means that if an individual is currently working between 7 p.m. and 9 p.m. on a weekday, those 2 hours will be paid at plain time rates rather than the premium time rates of time and a third. The BMA considered this carefully, as we know that this would be a significant concession. However, as we say, this was a red line for employers, and any contract that they were willing to offer required a change to the definition of plain time. After careful deliberation, the committee decided that the funding and the contractual improvements achieved elsewhere went some way toward mitigating the impact of this change, especially in light of individual choice, and therefore decided to proceed on that basis. It is important to be clear that this does not mean that a standard working day necessarily becomes any longer. Those working full-time will still be on 10 PA contracts at 40 hours, and the issue remains how you and your employers agree to job plan those hours. The option to be rewarded for undertaking premium time work through a 33% hourly pay supplement or a 3-hour PA has been retained in the new contract. These changes make it less expensive for an employer to schedule SAS doctors to work between 7 p.m. and 9 p.m. on a weekday. However, it does not necessarily mean that you will be working between 7 p.m. and 9 p.m. in the same way that there are no restrictions at the moment to you being asked to work in those hours. Any changes will, as ever, remain subject to agreement through the job planning process. We have tried to mitigate this as far as possible by introducing a range of safeguards, which we are going to set out in detail later, as well as by increasing on-call availability supplements. When we entered into these negotiations, we wanted to ensure that those working the most onerous on-call patterns were better remunerated. We argued that where SAS doctors worked on-call patterns, they were more likely than consultants to be called into their workplace than to respond by phone and to return to their workplace later. On that basis, it was unreasonable for them to receive a lower on-call availability supplement than their consultant colleagues. As a result, we have negotiated for the current supplements of 2, 4 and 6% to be increased by aligning with the supplements that consultants receive. These are set out in this table. Category A, which we believe will apply to the vast majority of SAS doctors, requires them to return to work immediately, while Category B applies to phone consultations only.
So what are the safeguards? We know from our members that preserving their work-life balance is a priority, and in some cases is precisely the reason that they chose a career as a SAS doctor. The current specialty doctor and associate specialist contracts offer little in the way of real protections, which we think are required for a modern workforce. A number of these safeguards were previously being discussed as part of the consultant contract negotiations before they stalled. We have also sought to introduce additional protections that are more specific to our members. The important thing to bear in mind is that all these protections that the 2008 contracts do not currently provide. We are looking to introduce limits and maximums that are new and don't exist in those contracts. As with the extension of plain time, it does not mean you will suddenly be working the maximum of the safeguard limit if you do not do so already. The intention of the safeguards is to protect those who already work more onerous patterns. We have secured the following protections in the new contracts. A provision stating that the majority, that is no less than 60%, of work should normally take place in standard working hours rather than out of hours, unless otherwise mutually agreed. Where an existing job plan is already exceeding the limit of 40% out of hours, the employer and the doctor will work towards decreasing this until the limit is reached. This will protect a number of our SAS members who are currently being asked to work a disproportionate amount of their job plan in unsocial hours. In order to preserve SAS doctors' work-life balance, we have introduced a limit that the maximum number of weekends, either whole or part weekends, that they can be asked to work in a year is 13, except where existing rotas of a greater frequency already exist. For those rotas, the shared intention is that the frequency will be reduced by a date in the future to be agreed between the doctor and the employer. There is currently no limit to the number of weekends that you can be asked to work. And what we know that this has had a detrimental impact on doctors' personal lives. For the purposes of this provision, the definition of a weekend will be any time that falls between 1 minute past midnight on a Saturday to 11:59 p.m. on a Sunday, meaning that if you work any time between those hours, that will count as one of your 13 weekends. Elective work will not normally be scheduled to finish later than 9 p.m. unless mutually agreed. There are also new protections for those working a full shift rota, a maximum of 4 consecutive nights, where at least 3 hours each night fall between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m., a maximum of 4 consecutive long day shifts, and a minimum period of 46 hours before and after transition between day and night shifts. We have agreed improved occupational health provisions that make clear that obligations around occupational health assessments are incumbent upon the employer. We are not able, due to discrimination laws, to have provisions which allow aging doctors to insist on being removed from, say, onerous on-call rotas or shift patterns. However, our expectation is that where such working patterns are having a deleterious effect on a doctor's health, that they can rely on this provision to insist on an occupational health assessment in order to certify the impact that such work is having and recommend that reasonable adjustments be made to their role. We have introduced a strong compensatory rest mechanism so that when a doctor is scheduled to work after a busy night on call, they would be able to declare with no detriment that they are too tired to work. Any displaced time activity will either be rescheduled within a doctor's agreed work schedule covered by colleagues or cancelled, and we will have no impact on the doctor's earnings. We have also introduced a limit of 72 hours in which an individual can be asked by their employer to cover for the unforeseen absence of a colleague, after which time the employer must make suitable alternative arrangements. There is also a flexible working commitment stating that work patterns should support flexible working and take account of equality and diversity to ensure that any individuals and specific groups are not adversely affected. There are improved requirements for food, drink, and rest facilities for those working in unsocial hours. Finally, reference to the working time regulations has been written into the contract, which may be important now that we are no longer subject to the European Working Time Directive.
We know from members that it can be a struggle securing appropriate levels of SPA time through their job planning processes. In particular, we know that some employers try to offer only the contractual minimum of 1 PA of SPA time, and in some cases even less, and try to force all manner of activities into that single PA. In order to address this, we have agreed with management side that the contract will explicitly state that the minimum of 1 PA of SPA time required by the contract is to be used for job planning, appraisal and revalidation only. This will be accompanied by joint guidance which encourages employers to have regular conversations about additional SPA time to allow for other vital activities such as teaching, training and research to take place. In Wales, we have committed to work with the government to strengthen the long-standing Wales Good Practice Guide, which strongly encourages 2 SPAs to be provided to all SAS doctors. At present, SAS doctors in England and Northern Ireland are the only groups that have no contractual offer of additional leave after 7 years in the grade. In order to bring SAS doctors in line with the majority of other NHS staff groups, NHS employers have agreed that those who have completed a minimum of 7 years in the grade shall receive an additional day of annual leave. Any SAS doctor that already receives more than this through a local policy will of course continue to receive that greater amount. SAS doctors in Wales will continue to receive the same amount of leave as they have previously. 5 weeks and 3 days rise into 6 weeks and 3 days after 2 years, in line with all other staff groups in the NHS in Wales. Whether through surveys by the BMA, the GMC, or the NHS, we repeatedly hear that SAS doctors are most likely to be the victims of bullying. That is why both parties agreed to produce guidance which will encourage employers to introduce a SAS advocate. This will be a strategic role to promote and improve support for SAS doctors' health and well-being, designed to help SAS doctors share their experiences and improve their visibility within the organisation. They will also be expected to generate work in response to SAS doctor concerns, whether that comes in relation to job planning and workload issues, occupational health concerns, or matters of general well-being. They will be there to advocate effectively, to challenge, and to effect change with senior management. We are hopeful that the creation of such a role will be beneficial to SAS doctors where it is introduced and will be aligned with our broader implementation of the SAS Charter. The other key aim of management side through these negotiations was to move away from the old temporary contract schedules and, in a few places, the outdated General Council conditions, and to align SAS doctors with other staff groups on the NHS staff terms and conditions. The temporary schedules cover issues like maternity leave, the employment break scheme, balancing work and personal life, caring for children and adults, and flexible working arrangements. The vast majority of the related sections of the NHS staff terms and conditions of service are the same as the equivalent provisions in the current contract. In some areas, such as through the introduction of shared parental leave, that is, enhancements to the same level as occupational maternity and adoption pay, and bereavement leave, that is 2 weeks paid leave for a parent who loses a child of any age, the provisions represent an improvement. The most significant issue is with the removal of the schedule on redundancy arrangements in England, which are significantly more favourable under the current contract. The current schedule sets a maximum of 2 years' pay based on 1 month per year's service. Under the NHS Terms and Conditions of Service, there are 2 relevant provisions. One sets a cap on earnings used to calculate the entitlement at £80,000 per year. The second sets a maximum payment of £160,000. Doctors in Wales and Northern Ireland are unaffected by these provisions. Having reviewed relevant data, we have seen that, as one really would expect of a group of highly skilled doctors, redundancy appears to be a very rare occurrence, with the vast majority of doctors either seeking employment elsewhere or finding suitable alternative work with the same employer. For that reason, we have agreed to accept alignment on these issues with the NHS staff terms and conditions of service. This would mean that future changes to these schedules are subject to negotiations by the NHS Staff Council, on which the BMA has a seat, rather than by the BMA directly. In England, in the first and third years of the 3-year transition period, we have negotiated ring-fenced funding which will be dedicated to helping SAS doctors develop in their careers. The figures are still being finalised, but will be set out in the framework agreement for England. This funding will be made available at trust level and will be dispersed in consultation with the local negotiating committees and, where one is in place, the SAS advocate. The BMA and NHS employers will be producing guidance which sets out potential uses of the funding, including setting out ways in which it should not be used, for example, to support employers' existing obligations around study leave. This non-recurrent funding will be separate to the SAS development funding currently held by Health Educational England, which is controlled separately.
So what are the advantages to the contract package being offered? A multiple year pay deal of 3% investment per full-time equivalent per year over 3 years to introduce contract reform. This enables significant improvements to the contract, which along with the restructuring of the pay scale means that doctors will experience over the next 3 years a cumulative pay increase, which is likely to be higher than what will be achieved through the DDRB process. The introduction of a new senior SAS grade, something that hasn't been available at a national level since the closure of the associate specialist grade in 2008, creating a clear career framework for SAS doctors to develop through. This specialist grade will enable these senior doctors to receive the recognition they deserve. A new flatter pay scale that is better under a career average pension scheme allows for fast progression, and that we think will better reward SAS doctors over the course of their careers. A number of new safeguards to protect SAS doctors working the most onerous, unsocial hours working patterns and to preserve a reasonable work-life balance. Increased on-call availability supplements in line with those received by consultants. They will also have an additional day of annual leave after 7 years in the grade. Guidance to support the introduction of a new SAS advocate role to promote and improve support for SAS doctors' health and well-being. There will be ring-fenced funding dedicated to SAS development, disbursed in consultation with the local negotiating committee and SAS advocate, and in line with guidance produced by the BMA and NHS employers. There will also be improved pay and provisions for shared parental leave and child bereavement leave. Perhaps most importantly, the opportunity for existing SAS doctors on national contracts to have an individual choice of whether or not they want to move to the new contracts. So what are the disadvantages? Any contract negotiation involves trade-offs, but we think the negatives of the contract are limited to 3 issues. The first is the extension of plain time from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. on weekdays currently to 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. on weekdays, meaning that weekday work between 7 p.m. and 9 p.m. would be paid at standard rates. While this doesn't mean that a standard day will necessarily become longer and would still involve an agreement at job planning, it will become less expensive for employers to schedule work at that time. Secondly, there is no equivalent to the current provision in the associate specialist contract that gives an associate specialist doctor the right to decline to undertake elective work in premium time. However, it is worth noting that if an associate specialist doctor decides that this provision is important to them, they will in any case retain the right to remain on the existing contract and keep that provision. Thirdly, the changes to redundancy payments. We believe that the offer of individual choice on whether to move to the new contracts or not based on your individual circumstances limits the negative impact of these trade-offs. So what is our recommendation? On balance, it is the BMA's UK SAS Committee's recommendation that you vote in favour of this contract package. While we have not been able to secure everything that we hoped for, we believe the new contracts will offer an attractive career framework for future SAS doctors and better reward existing ones, offering them improved pay and recognition for the work they do. As we have managed to secure an individual choice for all existing doctors on national contracts, We do not think there is a good reason for anyone to vote against this contract. If it doesn't work for you, you are under no obligation to move on to it. If it doesn't work for you, we would urge you to think about other SAS doctors, your friends and colleagues, who might want to choose to move on to these contracts, whether for the safeguards, the pay, or the career prospects. The only way for them to have that option is for you to vote in favor of the contract package. It is also worth noting that assuming the contracts are approved at the referendum, even after they are introduced, we will continue to maintain and seek to improve the contracts via the Joint Negotiating Committee, JNC SAS.
Alongside these virtual roadshows, we will be opening a referendum to all BMA SAS members on whether or not to accept the introduction of these new contracts. Remember, though, that this is not the same as whether you yourself want to be placed on the contract. It's just about whether you want to have the opportunity to decide whether you want to be put on the new contract and whether you think the contracts negotiated are a positive development for the future. If the contract package is approved at a referendum of members, then the BMA and NHS employers will work together to produce contract guidance and other documents to support implementation to further help individuals decide whether the contract is right for them. It is very likely that the process will end and no further discussions about contract reform will take place. The Department of Health and Social Care and the Treasury have made it clear that the funding offered of 3% per year over 3 years, which was obviously being offered before COVID-19 and the current economic context, would no longer be on offer. As a result, all SAS doctors would continue to be subject to the DDRB process. For those on the 2008 Specialty Doctor contract, you will have a 6-month window of opportunity from the 1st of April 2021 to inform your employer whether you want to move on to the new 2021 Specialty Doctor contract. If you were on another closed national grade, such as the old staff grade contract, you will also be offered the choice of whether or not to move on to the new 2021 contract. Likewise, for those on the 2008 closed National Associate Specialist contract, you will have a 6-month window to decide whether or not you would like to move to the new Specialist grade contract. They will need to demonstrate that they meet the criteria for the role, but we expect that the vast majority of existing associate specialists will be able to do so. Individuals who wish to move to the new contract would confirm through an expression of interest with their employer within the set time window. They would then undertake a job planning process with the employer, which should commence no later than 1 month following the expression of interest and be completed within 3 months. Following this, the employer would offer the job plan and salary package in writing, with the doctor having 21 days to then decide whether to accept or decline that offer. In exceptional circumstances, doctors who were not able to express interest within the time window because they were on long-term leave, such as sickness or maternity leave, will still have an opportunity to do so. Where an individual had expressed an interest within the 6-month window of opportunity, they will be entitled to pay backdated to the 1st of April 2021 based on the agreed job plan in place, up to the date that the new job plan takes effect. The detail will be set out in the contracts and a summary will be shared with members as part of the package of documents supporting the contract. Guidance will also be produced to inform individuals' decision-making processes before and during the window of opportunity. Voting in the referendum on the new contracts is a benefit of BMA membership. We would urge those who aren't already members to sign up now so that they have the opportunity to vote when the referendum opens. There will be a period of time during the referendum window when new members will still be able to register in time to vote. Members will also be able to ask questions at these roadshow events or submit them to our dedicated email address sascontract@bma.org.uk.